There is a silent theater that takes place before any real conversation, a space where words are tested, rehearsed, discarded, where the other has already responded, already reacted, already judged, all while the mouth remains closed. It is a complete dialogue that never leaves the shadows of the mind, but which consumes time, energy, attention. The inner voice constructs scenes with cinematic precision. It imagines facial expressions, tones of response, uncomfortable silences. Each word is weighed, measured, adjusted, as if there were a mandatory rehearsal before the actual performance. And nobody warned that this is common. If any part of this feels familiar to you, you're not alone. And if you ever feel like sharing your experience, the comments are open. This process happens in seconds, but it seems to last much longer. The mind creates alternative versions of the same phrase, tests possible scenarios, calculates emotional risks. It's an invisible process that doesn't appear in any communication manual, but everyone knows about it. The entire conversation takes place in silence before the first word is uttered. The conversation has already begun, but no one has noticed. It takes place in the quiet of a mind that never rests, that needs to organize the chaos before transforming it into sound. Entire sentences are being uttered internally, with pauses, emphases, careful choices. The other person doesn't yet know they are being summoned to a secret dialogue where they have already answered everything. This mental rehearsal isn't planning, it's almost instinct, as if the inner voice needed permission to become external and could only achieve that after testing all possibilities. There's no written script, but there's an invisible order, a need to foresee, to control, to minimize errors before they even happen. Real time drags on while this happens. 3 seconds of silence can contain 10 different versions of the same sentence. The person next to you waits for an answer, unaware that within that silence there has already been a question, a reply, a counter-reply, a complete theater staged in the darkness of thought, where the audience is only one. And then, when something is finally said, it sounds simple, natural, but it carries the weight of all the rehearsals that no one saw. The mind rehearses responses for reactions that may never come. Imagination doesn't wait for confirmation. It anticipates smiles, frowns, awkward silences. It constructs reactions with impressive detail, the tone of voice the other person will use, the exact moment they'll look away. All this before a single word is spoken, as if the mind needed to prepare for all possible futures, even the improbable ones. These imaginary responses take on a life of their own. They become so real that they influence what will be said. A phrase is abandoned because, in the internal simulation, it generated discomfort. Another is chosen because, in the mental theater, it worked perfectly. The person is reacting to something that hasn't happened yet, adjusting to phantoms created by their own mind. The curious thing is that the actual reaction, when it comes, rarely carries what was act. The other person responds unexpectedly, with different words, in a different tone, but the mind has already spent energy rehearsing defenses, explanations, counter-arguments. It prepared for a battle that never occurred, and now it needs to improvise in the face of what is actually happening. This cycle repeats itself so many times that it goes unnoticed. It has become a natural part of the speaking process, an invisible ritual where one struggles against imaginary versions of the other, trying to win conversations that exist only as shadows projected in the silence. There is an imagined version of the other listening with complete attention. In the mental rehearsal, the other is always present, completely attentive, absorbing each word carefully. There are no distractions, no cell phone in hand, no wandering gaze. This imaginary version listens with an intensity that rarely exists in reality. It is a perfect listener, built out of the need to be understood. This fictional audience validates every word choice. It understands the nuances, grasps the intentions, perceives the details. In the theater of the mind, there are no misunderstandings. Everything flows as it should. The other responds at exactly the right moment, with the right reaction. It's an ideal conversation happening in a place that doesn't exist. Reality, of course, offers something different. The other person is tired, distracted, thinking about other things. They interrupt, change the subject, interpret things unexpectedly. The imagined total attention dissolves in the face of the real, imperfect, human presence, and a mismatch arises between what was rehearsed and what is happening, but the mind continues to create these idealized versions, because perhaps it's easier to talk to someone who exists only as a possibility, someone who never disappoints, never judges wrongly, never loses the thread of the conversation. A mirror created to reflect exactly what needs to be seen. The tone of the phrase is tested internally before being used. It's not just what to say, it's how to say it. The inner voice experiments with different intonations, like a musician tuning an instrument before a performance. A phrase can sound aggressive with one emphasis, vulnerable with another, indifferent with a third. Each variation carries a distinct emotional weight, and the mind must choose which one will survive the silence. This tone test happens in layers. First, the raw word, then the rhythm. Next, the emotional temperature: warm, cold, neutral. The mind adjusts, recalibrates, seeks the impossible balance between seeming sincere and seeming controlled, between expressing too much and expressing too little. It's a delicate calculation done in fractions of a second. Sometimes, the perfect phrase found internally gets lost on its way out. The imagined tone doesn't translate to the real voice. What sounded confident in the mind comes out shaky. What seemed light gains unexpected weight. There's a distance between intention and execution, and that distance is where silent frustration resides. Even so, the rehearsal continues, because giving up on it would be like jumping without a safety net. The mind insists on testing, adjusting, predicting, trying to create a version of itself that sounds exactly as it should sound, knowing that it may never succeed. Small mental adjustments attempt to avoid future discomfort. Every word is a potential trap. The mind knows this and works preventively, like someone diffusing invisible bombs before they explode. An adjective is changed because it might sound aggressive. A question is reformulated because it might seem intrusive. These are microscopic adjustments made hastily, trying to avoid something that doesn't yet exist but which the imagination has already painted as a disaster. This internal editing process is exhausting. There's no manual, no clear rules, just a vague sense of emotional danger that needs to be neutralized. The original phrase was honest, direct, but carried risk, so it's softened, diluted, protected by layers of caution. What remains is a safer version, but also further from the initial truth. The curious thing is that this anticipated discomfort rarely materializes. The person on the other end wouldn't have reacted badly. They wouldn't have been offended. They wouldn't have distanced themselves. But the mind doesn't take risks. It prefers the protection of ambiguity, the comfort of imprecision. Better not to say anything at all than to say it and regret it. And so, the discourse is shaped by hypothetical fears, by discomforts that live only as ghosts in the shadows of thought. The conversation happens, but always with reservations, always a little short of what it could have been. The mind chooses the perfect moment, which almost never comes. There's an imaginary timing where everything falls into place. A moment when the other person will be receptive, the atmosphere calm, the words will flow effortlessly. The mind waits for this ideal instant, constructed with cinematic precision, but reality doesn't follow scripts. The perfect moment always remains a little ahead, like a mirage receding as you move forward. Meanwhile, real opportunities pass by. Conversations begin and end without the rehearsed phrase finding its opening. The other person speaks, changes the subject, gets up, and leaves, and the imagined window never opens. Only the feeling remains that something was missing, not courage, but the right conditions, as if the universe hadn't cooperated with the internal planning. This waiting creates a strange cycle. The longer it's delayed, the more weight the phrase gains. What was simple becomes solemn. What was light becomes dense. The lost opportunity transforms into a symbol of something greater, and saying it now seems to require even more special circumstances. The perfect moment recedes even further, deep down. Perhaps the mind knows that this moment doesn't exist, that any instant will do if there's a real desire to speak. But continuing to wait is more comfortable. It's a way of postponing not only the conversation, but the responsibility for what it might unleash. There's a secret dialogue between what you want to say and what sounds safe. Two voices converse in silence. One knows the complete truth, raw, and unfiltered. The other knows the consequences, the risks, the emotional cost. They negotiate internally, seeking a middle ground that rarely satisfies both. What is meant to be said is too honest. What sounds safe is too vague. Between these two extremes, the compromise phrase is born. This negotiation happens so quickly it's barely noticed, but it leaves its mark. The phrase that finally comes out carries signs of both voices, fragments of sincerity mixed with layers of protection. It's not a lie, but it's not the whole truth either. It's what's possible, what's tolerable, what manages to cross the barrier between the internal and the external without causing collapse. Sometimes, the voice of security wins completely. What is said bears no resemblance to what was felt. The distance between intention and expression becomes abysmal. The person speaks, but does not recognize themselves in their own words. They have become merely a cautious translator of emotions that have lost their true name along the way. At other times, there is a fragile balance. A little truth manages to escape, wrapped in enough security not to frighten. It's not complete satisfaction, but it is movement, a small step towards being understood, without completely relinquishing the protection that the mind insists on maintaining. Imagination foresees consequences for every possible word. Each sentence carries unseen futures. The mind sees them before they exist: chain reactions, mood swings, subtle estrangements. One wrong word can alter everything, or so it seems. Then the imagination does its predictive work, calculating emotional probabilities like someone solving complex equations. If you say this, that will happen. If you remain silent, something else will happen. These predictions are detailed, almost prophetic. The mind paints complete scenarios. The other person's face closing up, the awkward silence that will follow, the conversation that will never be the same again. Or the opposite, the connection that may arise, the shared relief, the closeness achieved. They are parallel futures, all possible, all frightening in their own way. The weight of this anticipated vision is paralyzing because every choice of word also becomes a choice of destiny. There's no way to know which future is real, but they all seem equally concrete in the imagination. So the sentence gets stuck in this limbo of possibilities, constantly being rewritten to avoid the worst scenarios and achieve the best. But reality, when it finally manifests itself, rarely follows these predictions. The consequences are different, smaller or larger, but always different. The mind missed the mark, as it always does. And yet, in the next conversation, it will predict again. It will calculate again, because giving up the illusion of control seems riskier than continuing to try. The external silence hides an internal scene full of details. On the outside, only stillness, a natural pause, an apparent moment of reflection, nothing that draws attention. But inside, there is intense movement, imaginary characters conversing, scenarios being built and destroyed, emotions being tested in real time. It's a whole universe, unfolding while the face remains neutral, while the body remains motionless. This contrast is almost absurd. The richness of what happens internally finds no correspondence on the outside. There are colors, sounds, emotional textures, a whole sensory experience created by the mind. Meanwhile, the visible world registers only silence. No one imagines the complexity hidden behind eyes that seem merely inattentive or lost in thought. The internal scene has its own logic, its own time. It can last seconds or extend indefinitely depending on the emotional urgency. There are complete dialogues, elaborate arguments, dramatic resolutions, all this while externally nothing has changed. The person continues to sit, breathing, existing discreetly while internally experiencing intensities that no one witnesses. And then, when the silence is broken, the phrase that emerges seems simple, almost banal. There's no way to translate everything that happened before. There isn't enough vocabulary to explain the inner journey that preceded those few words. The mental theater has fulfilled its role and dissolved, leaving only a trace, a phrase that doesn't reveal the whole story. Many phrases die in the mind after fulfilling their internal purpose. Not everything that is thought needs to be said. The mind knows this, even if it doesn't consciously admit it. Some phrases exist only to be rehearsed, tested, felt internally. They fulfill their function in silence, organizing emotions, clarifying thoughts, giving form to chaos. And then they simply cease to be necessary. They die before they are born, and there is no tragedy in that. This graveyard of unspoken phrases is vast, full of confessions that lost their urgency, questions that found their own answers, outpourings that dissolved simply by being formulated. The mind needed to construct them to understand itself, not to share them. The process of thinking the phrase was already enough. The rest would be redundant. There is a strange wisdom in this natural selection of inner speech. Not every thought deserves a voice. Not every emotion needs a witness. Some things resolve themselves simply by being observed by one's own consciousness, without needing to cross the sound barrier. These are private truths, dialogues that end where they began inside, and perhaps that's part of the balance. If everything one thinks was said, the outside world would be filled with unnecessary noise. Strategic silence isn't just fear or caution. Sometimes it's wisdom. It's recognizing that certain words have already done their job before they even existed as sound, and they can rest in peace where they were born. This silent mental theater is not a flaw. It's not a sign of deep insecurity nor a symptom of something that needs fixing. It's simply how the human mind deals with the complexity of transforming thought into language, intention into sound, an invisible process that everyone goes through to varying degrees and with different intensities. The imaginary conversation before the real conversation is a form of internal organization. The mind tries to map unknown emotional territories before actually stepping into them. It rehearses, anticipates, adjusts. It doesn't always get it right. It's not always necessary, but it's part of standard human equipment. There's nothing wrong with needing this rehearsal to find one's voice. What happens in that space between thinking and speaking is as real as what is said aloud. It involves layers of processing, attempts at translation, internal negotiations. And recognizing this brings a certain peace, knowing that you are not alone in this private theater, that other minds also construct complete scenes before uttering a single word. Perhaps the secret isn't eliminating this process, but understanding it, recognizing when it helps and when it only hinders, when it protects and when it imprisons. Internal dialogue will always have its role, but sometimes it's worth risking saying something before it's perfect, before the ideal moment arrives, before all the consequences are foreseen, because reality, with all its unpredictability, is often more generous than imagined scenarios. If you recognized yourself in these observations, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we continue exploring these silent behaviors that we all experience, but rarely discuss. Until the next video.